And joining me now is John Bolton. He has served under two U.S. presidents as National Security Advisor to President Trump and as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush. Mr. Bolton is one of Washington's most hawkish voices on Iran. He is a critic of nuclear diplomacy and a longtime advocate of regime change in Tehran. Ambassador Bolton, it's good to have you back on the program. Let me start by just asking, what's your reaction to this agreement between the U.S. and Iran?
Well, I think it's a very bad deal for the United States, Israel, and the Gulf Arab countries. I think this gives Iran far more than it had even before the war started. I think it's a result of Trump's focus on gasoline prices in the United States. He wants to open the Strait of Hormuz to get the global price of oil down and reduce the cost of gasoline here in the U.S. And he has given Iran concessions that are difficult to justify if they ever come to pass. Nonetheless, it's hard to be sure, even with this agreement, that the Strait of Hormuz itself will open.
You have made it clear repeatedly that Iran cannot be trusted and that negotiations will not end the nuclear threat. President Trump says that this new deal shows strength and common sense. Is he being played by Tehran?
Well, I think he's being played by Tehran, but let's be clear, even his use of force here was for reasons he's never been able to articulate. We don't know what his objective was or what he thought he was going to achieve. He did very little preparation. He didn't brief the American people or Congress, our allies, the opposition in Iran before beginning the strikes. So he's put himself in a trap of his own making, and now he's trying to get out of it. I think the Iranians could see he was desperate to find some way he could declare that the war was over, and as I say, focus almost entirely on domestic American political considerations.
Iran is once again pledging not to pursue nuclear weapons, and it says it will accept further talks. It's also going to have access to frozen assets. Stops on the sale of its oil are going to be lifted. There's talk of a path towards sanctions relief being offered. I mean, is this a Trump version of pay to play? I mean, is Washington paying Iran to pause its nuclear ambitions?
Well, it follows a very clear pattern of negotiation with rogue states that are seeking nuclear weapons, whether it's Iran, North Korea, or others. They want tangible economic benefits up front, in exchange for which they say, yes, we'll take steps to limit our nuclear program down the road. And over and over and over again, in the case of North Korea, in the case of the regime in Iran, they get the economic benefits, but somehow never get around to restricting their nuclear program. So we've bought this horse many times before, and it never works out. And I don't think this one will either. But it certainly will give Iran the ability to sell oil itself on international markets and bring in billions of dollars of revenue, which the regime will use to rebuild its instruments of state power, the Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, the besieged militia, to reconstitute its nuclear weapons program, reconstitute its network of terrorist proxies around the region. In a relatively short period of time, we could be right back to where we were before the war.
Ambassador, you have long argued that Iran's nuclear threat, that it can't be solved by negotiation. And after 4 months of war, we don't have a regime change in Tehran. We've got the U.S. president now invoking his powers to force U.S. companies to manufacture weapons to replenish the dangerously low stockpiles. After all of this, do you still stand by your position that the only solution is military action and regime change in Iran?
I think the argument that Vice President Vance is now making that the regime is going to change its behavior has been a fallacy for 47 years. And let's be clear, we haven't had 4 months of war. We had 6 months of bombing a regime that spent 47 years digging itself into power at the expense of their neighbors and at the expense of the people of Iran. I think the regime back in January was at one of the weakest points, maybe the weakest point since it took power in the 1979 revolution. It was facing widespread demonstrations all across the country by people unhappy with their desperate economic conditions. And the response of the regime was to murder 40,000 plus of its own citizens. That's the kind of regime we're dealing with. That's not the kind of regime that honors international agreements, as it has not honored the international status of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, let's be clear, this whole effort to take control of the strait, for those who care about it, is a gross violation of international law.
But the strait was open before this war began, though, Ambassador. I mean, didn't this war actually give the Iranians a new bit of leverage?
Well, sure. I mean, I know people care about international law. We should hear a little outrage about what Iran has done, but it's not the first time. They've tried to interfere with commercial traffic in the Gulf and in the Strait before. In the Reagan administration, the United States reflagged Kuwaiti tankers with American flags so we could escort them out of the Gulf and the Strait. And what they've done is an effort really to establish hegemony over all of the Gulf Arab states, with implications for freedom of the seas all around the world. This is something that anybody who can read a map, and certainly the U.S. Navy can read maps, could see coming. And it's a mistake of one of many mistakes Trump made in the conduct of this whole operation that Congress should take a very close look at.
Would you say, Ambassador, that the biggest mistake that we have seen in the last 4 months is that the U.S. military did not go in hard enough? I mean, would you have advocated that the Pentagon put boots on the ground? Is that the path you would have advised?
Well, the first thing is not how you would conduct the war. The first thing is, what's your objective? What's your objective? And you could ask Donald Trump that question today. He still can't give you a clear answer. If the objective was regime change, which it seemed to be a little bit, at least at the beginning, then you can safely say that Trump did not do anywhere near the amount of preparatory work that was necessary, especially if he believed he wasn't going to put boots on the ground. There was no effort to contact the opposition inside Iran, to help them out, help them organize, provide them resources, whether it was money, communications, guns, whatever it took. I think the regime was at a very weak point in January. I think the people of Iran, for many reasons, are tired of the regime. But the regime has a monopoly on a force. It's brutal, and it uses force. In the past several months, they've continued to execute people that they believe are regime opponents. So, when a regime deals with its own people that way, it tells you a lot about how they're going to deal with their foreign commitments.
Is all of this, am I hearing you right, is all of this proof that the U.S. president allowed an ally, and this ally being Israel, allowed Israel to convince him to go to war, to do something that was actually not in the interest of U.S. foreign policy?
Well, again, the interests of U.S. foreign policy have to depend on what objective you're pursuing. I can tell you that in the first term, I tried to persuade Trump that our objective should be regime change. Once you arrive at the objective, then you can decide the means to use it. He never accepted it in the first term, even though Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who had the same job in Trump's first term, made the case to him as well. So I don't think Netanyahu said anything new or different in the second term than he did in the first term. I don't know what convinced Trump to use force here. It must have been some other variable. And I still, to this day, don't know what he thought he was going to accomplish.
Well, now we've got a situation where we're hearing that the Israelis are not going to back down in southern Lebanon. We heard from the U.S. Vice President today, basically warning Israel, not to lose the only ally you have right now. I mean, we've got a situation where Israel could torpedo this deal. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, let me put it another way. We're in a situation right now where Hezbollah, essentially an arm of the Iranian state, poses an existential threat to Israelis. There have been people evacuated from their homes in northern Israel beginning on October 8th, the day after the Hamas attack in Gaza, when Hezbollah began its attacks in in northern Israel. This is called the right of self-defense, and that right of self-defense is still being exercised today. I think that this is one of the administration's biggest mistakes, and I'll tell you who is most concerned about that administration approach. It's not just in Israel, it's in the Gulf Arab states. Who wonder if the U.S. isn't prepared to stick with Israel, how likely are we to stick with the Gulf Arabs?
Ambassador, let me ask you just before we run out of time, if this deal collapses between the U.S. and Iran, what do you think will happen next?
In the Trump administration, I'm reluctant to predict anything. What Trump is focused on is his own political standing in the U.S. He's worried about the upcoming November elections, and if true to form, the Iranians, for example, try to impose tolls on ships going through the Strait of Hormuz in clear violation of international law. And I'll say it again, freedom of the seas has been a principle of American diplomacy and foreign policy since before we were a country, not something to trade away lightly. And if Iran does attempt to assert control over the strait, Trump's in a very, very difficult position. What he ought to do is use force on behalf of freedom of the seas, not just for the U.S., but for everybody else.
Well, we will see if he ends up having to do that. Ambassador Bolton, we appreciate your time and your insights today. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me.